from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we are very pleased to bring you the topic communications and team building in the workplace. We spend much of our life at the workplace, and obviously it's very important what goes on there. And we're very pleased to welcome to the program a guest today who is willing to discuss a number of issues under that topic. We welcome Dr. Eli Ross. Our guest holds a BA in economics from UCLA. He has an MA from that same institution in educational administration, and he has a PhD in psychology from the United States International University. Dr. Ross and his spouse are in private practice in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Dr. Ross, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to looking into some information that would be very helpful to our viewers and also employers and how we deal with communication at the workplace. And I'm very pleased to have our two regular panelists to question our guest today. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
Well, as Tony mentioned, Dr. Ross, we do spend a lot of our time in the workplace. Who sets the tone for the workplace? Who really sets the tone as far as communication is concerned where we work?
That's a good question. I think we all set the tone. Sometimes we think leadership begins and models where it will be, and I think there's truth to that too, but we also have to be aware that everything we say has an impact. It's like the ripple effect. I think of communication as like taking a Rorschach test, you know, that ink blot stuff in psychology, and everything we do has a relationship to projecting what's inside of us, and so do our words, our tone, the way we kid or don't kid, the way we're serious or not kidding. So we all have a responsibility in setting the tone.
And in that workplace, what do you think are the components of a good workplace communication?
Well, if I were to come up with 10 commandments in communication, maybe I'd start out like this, and perhaps I can illustrate it by this story, which is a true story. I remember 10 years ago, my wife and I were sitting out near the patio inside the house looking out, and she's saying to me, "The dog is scratching." I said, "Okay." Again, "The dog is scratching." I says, "Okay, fine, I'll take care of it." She says, "The dog is scratching." Now, in my mind, I knew the dog had a skin condition, but she was really saying, no, the dog is scratching to get out of the house. So I guess the first point I want to make is that number one, communication can never be perfect. It's an invariable factor to expect the fact there will be differences and or misunderstandings. That's premise number one. And if we can accept it from that point of view, we aren't going to be as upset when things go awry. Second point I think I would make is we all need to learn how to construct our communication in a way that it's really going to be effective. For example, would you believe when a couple comes in for counseling, or let's say nobody's ever made a telephone call and said, "Dr. Ross, I'd like to come in your office and pay you to tell you what a good marriage I've got." You only come in when there's an issue. So you can be sure that there are issues that are going to be resolved that are going to come up in the workplace, and being alert and ready for that is important. I guess if I had a third item I would comment about is the fact that it's very important to be a good listener. Sometimes we call it an active listener. The difference between just listening and active listening is that I can listen to everything you say and I've never made a response, and still that could be okay. But it's not as effective when you tell me, let's say, that you had a rough time that day, and I come in to you, "Boy, it sounds like today wasn't your best day." Then I'm participating in the communication with you. What I'm doing is recognizing your feelings. Now I'd say a fourth entity is to be able to give feedback, namely after you've heard that person, to recapitulate or restate. So I guess what I'm hearing is you had some bad parts of your day, but it turned out at the end it was pretty nice because you went out for dinner. So then I'm feeding back, and it tells that person I feel good. And that's very bonding. I came up somewhere in my seminars with doing what I call the 3 A's, or the concept that we all have to be appreciated, we all have to be acknowledged, and we all have to be adhered to. In other words, not to put down the other person and what they say. For example, "Oh, my finger hurts me. Let me see that." "Well, there's nothing wrong with that. You're a big baby." "What do you mean a big baby? It's my finger." "Oh, you're always complaining about something." So my feelings are being discarded. Feelings are neither good nor bad. Sometimes they're just a statement of where you're at, and the ability to recognize that is exceedingly important. I think a lot of relationships and marriages and elsewhere go awry because nobody's ever taught us that. I don't think anybody willingly or knowingly usually wants to destroy a relationship. It comes about because we don't have those awarenesses of communication skills.
Steve Sheen.
Eli, would you tell us a little bit about the difference between formal and informal communication channels in organizations and how important each is to overall communication in the workplace?
That's a good question. Nobody's asked me that between formal and informal communications. I would sort of say informal communications seem to be, as we casually say, good morning, how are you today? We don't really respect a response to that. I know sometimes I kid at the checkout stand when they routinely say to you, how are you today? And I say, have you got a half hour and what do you charge? They don't expect an answer like that. So informally, we go through the nominal things that one does as a matter of simple courtesy. That's what I would see mostly informal. Now, when it's a boss relationship to one who's under that person, we might verbally give a message or might even send a written memo, things like that. These are somewhat of informal structures. But I think a formalized structure in a workplace is where the person has a clear-cut identification of what's expected of them and how they will be adjudicated or evaluated, and yet at the same time to create a relaxed environment, friendly, but not so friendly that we lose the understanding of who's up and who needs to follow the instructions. I think the military is well defined that one. Not that I'm suggesting a military relationship. You always know when you're responsible and you're respectful to your commanding officer. So by the same token, I think we have to sense the personality of the person we're working with who's in charge, and where we have clear-cut needs for making sure we're going to be able to comply. We can ask our boss, could you please write it down, or would you like me to write this down and see if I have this understanding correctly? I think a lot of shortcomings and hard feelings come because these things are not clearly defined at times. To me, that would be the more formal aspect of communication in the workplace.
You mentioned earlier that communication is almost invariably imprecise. It's rarely perfect, if ever perfect. When you work with clients, do you talk at all about body language and how that affects the messages that people perceive and receive from us?
Sometimes that's an essence that has to be called to their attention. Most of us are not aware, for example, if we're fiddling with our pencil like this all the time, or whatever aspect we're indicating some part of our nervousness and so forth like that. I remember having one client who was, this gentleman was probably about 6'4", 6'5", had a Lincoln-esque appearance and beard, and you would ask him a question and he would, well, and it's like you're waiting 10 minutes to hear the next word like that, you know. And he wasn't really that aware that this would drive his wife up the wall waiting that long. She was more right, direct, and to the point, and this was years of that. And I had to kid him about that. I says, well, I think it's about time for me to take a nap, or can you stir me up a little bit? Now, you can't say that to everybody. And he kind of smiled a little bit. He says, well, you know, I have been told I do tend to take my time. But I think he was so accustomed to seeing his image being like Lincoln that he actually had a mindset that this is the way I need to carry myself, not realizing it was deleterious at home and sometimes at work too. Mm-hmm. So
does that awareness get back to what you were talking to us about earlier in terms of active listening? Is that a part of active listening, trying to gauge how your ongoing communication with someone is being received and pick up those signals as you're actually talking?
Yeah, that can be part of it, but whether or not you want to call that to the attention of the person, I think depends on the setting that you're in. Mm-hmm. For example, we can hear people speak incorrectly in their English. You know, I'm feeling good when really it should be an adverb. I'm feeling well, but I want to come in and make an issue of it, so I know when to discard that. But then there are times where you feel it will be helpful if you can come in low and slow and gentle, that people will listen if they feel threatened. Another very important thing is trying to avoid the use of you. Like, you do this, you do that, you're making too many mistakes, what's the matter with you? As opposed to talking about the situation. I think journalists are very good at that. If a reporter, particularly in student training, doesn't have a deadline to keep, you can say to that student, gee, you're always late. You're not keeping the schedule. You're holding us up. As opposed to, we have a deadline to be met. It hasn't been met, and it puts everybody on the spot. I talk about the situation rather than the person. They can glean the message out of that, but as soon as I say you, I'm pointing a finger, and they're going to be defensive. I think most of us aren't aware of how often we say you. For example, hey, you dirty slob, pick up those towels from the bathroom floor. Where do you think you are, in a barn or some other filthy place like where your father was raised? Loaded, you know, name calling, comparison, as opposed to the towels are on the bathroom floor. They need to be picked up. Please take care of it now. I talk about the need rather than wanting to lay the trip on the person, even if they are wrong, even if they are lazy, even if whatever their problem is. It's true, some people won't respond no matter what you say, but it's a lot better way and more likely to be effective of getting cooperation, whether that's in personal relationships or that happens to be in the workplace too.
We see a lot of organizational charts in corporations and at universities, other places. These are organizational charts, and they deal with communication and decision making. We often hear of those in two perspectives. One is the vertical process, and the other one's horizontal, and how much collaboration there is in that process versus how much is handed down in a process. What is your thinking along those two approaches, or some kind of integration of the two?
I've got a very small driveway in front of my house like this with only so much space that separates my property there, and in consideration my neighbor who feels that my cars or the guests coming to visit me will block his area, though there is a right to park anywhere you want, I suggest to my people, if you could park vertically against the curb, it'll be more comfortable. I guess I'm telling the story to say there's a time when communication is best horizontally and other times when it's vertical. I think it's vertical when there needs to be a clear-cut determination of what the job is. It's horizontal when you come together and do some brainstorming and group work to try and achieve the goals that each person is responsible for. In fact, in my seminars that I've recently started that I call Communication in the Workplace, deals with very major concepts which are overlooked because I think people tend to want to bring in those who will give them expertise specifically, and that's important, as opposed to what I call laying foundation for relationships. So I deal with team building and loyalty bonding. I just completed a significant seminar for significant business in the community, and the one thing the person said, what I liked about what you had to say is that you talked about going back to basics. I understand, for example, with Japanese, before you get into business relationships, they want to relax, they want to socialize, they want to get to know you a little bit. And similarly with this is most people work with their colleagues, or like I've had one person say doing a seminar in church at one time, and when I got them into small groups and I did my peer interview activity where they get to know each other, you know, I've been in this church 10 years, 15 years, and I never knew that you had an invalid son at home. So you see, people are yearning literally to be understood, to be acknowledged, to be appreciated. And the only way that takes place is that you bring them into a setting where that's possible. I was in the Marine Corps, and in San Diego, I went through boot camp. Downtown, they used to have the businessmen in the jewelry shops, particularly, who would be these hawkers. Hey, psst, Marine, come here, I got a great deal for you. I can't go outside, or an employer or a pastor, hey, come on in here, I got a great deal for you. We're going to have a seminar to make you feel better. Somebody, whether it's in a church or a business, has to be responsible for saying, the first thing I want is a solid foundation. I want my team to be bonded so they feel so strongly about my organization that they're going to know this is home for them, they like it, they want to be here, they want to stay as long as they can, and I'm going to provide that foundation for them. But it usually doesn't happen out of osmosis. It has to be created in that setting. That's the horizontal part of team building. Then when you give the vertical commands, you're more understanding and knowing what you're doing and why to execute that.
And some explanation with why it's necessary to do it.
Absolutely. There's like one friend of mine said, who's rather good at this stuff here, when somebody came in and asked him for a raise, he says, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. If you do your job, you can keep it. No less a raise, you know. Certain things are expected and you don't necessarily get rewards. But smart business people, particularly in sales, are always giving incentives. They're giving little spiffs, as they call them. You can get $10 here, you get so many sales a month, you're going to go get a free trip to Hawaii, or what's that organization that gives the ladies a free car to drive, you know, for a year if they keep their sales up. Those are great incentives. I think we could do more of that in the workplace.
I have one more question that's along this line. There's such diversity in individuals and their interests, especially in a large number of employees at a workplace. Some people are very, very self-motivated. They're very individualistic. They're almost loners, and they produce at the greatest level in that environment, whereas others love to collaborate with others and to do teamwork. What is your recommendation about fitting both of those needs? And I would assume some organizations would be more attuned to have both than the other.
Run me through that again. I'm not sure I quite got that now.
If you're at a place of employment, and let's suppose you have several thousand employees even, and you're in management, and you realize that you've got some very gifted employees that like to work alone. They don't like teamwork. Yet others are very, very gifted at it. And I know that you encourage teamwork, and I understand why that has merit. But how do you fit the individual into a setting that doesn't like teamwork?
I'll bounce back for a moment, digress just for a second. My philosophy of life is that all the material accoutrements, this chair, my sweater, whatever it is, are all instrumentalities by which we relate to people in the process of that production. And the real thing is a relationship, and how do you help people maximize their potential. Depending on an organization and what it needs is and how big it is and vast, those who are very creative, like in some of the software industry, Bill Gates, etc., they're very good apparently at recognizing individuality and creativity, and there's a sense in which you need to develop whether this person is going to be more valuable working to you in their own creative self. And at those junctures where they need to come together for team information, for team relationship or bonding, that's a skill. They may need to learn how to do that, given some help if they're not that comfortable working with other people. There are very, very fine minds around that still aren't comfortable in relationships. So I think when an employer can bring in the proper help as a seminar, I'm not here to put you in therapy or counseling. We want to give you some skills that is going to make it easier for you to move back and forth from your quiet creativity to the times you're going to be sharing. Most people, I think, can do that. I think sometimes people are let go from jobs when if they had the right kind of leadership and the people who could have brought help to them, that they could have learned how to accommodate where the boss felt that were the case. What I'm about to say is not new, but the seminar I did, the owner of this firm made the very clear statement to me. He says, this seminar is important because it's too expensive for me to lose people and to have to keep hiring and training new ones. If this gives them a foundation, I want you back and help us to do that. I came up with the idea of bringing me in on a retainer as their roving ambassador and Amtsbundsman. Goodwill has to circulate, and sometimes the boss is too close and people feel threatened. They always want to leave a good impression with the boss, but if they feel there's another person about in this Amtsbundsman role, they can feel more free to share.
Okay, Janelle.
I have a two-pronged question. It's going to go both directions. How does an employee approach a difficult boss? And how does a boss approach a difficult employee? So let's talk about it first from the employee going to the boss and communications from that level.
From the employee to the boss?
Yes. And then from the boss to the employee.
Right. There are bosses who haven't had my training, so obviously I can't make them as effective bosses as I think bosses can be. And I think depending on that personality of the boss, the trepidations or the relaxed mode with which an employee can approach the boss is one of those things that has to be adjudicated. You know, it's just one of those judgment calls. But in any event, even if there is tension between two people, the only thing you can really do is be yourself. And I believe in coming in low and slow, kindly and softly. And for example, if I want to come in for a raise, I might not want to say, you know, I've been working in this firm for 10 years and you really don't appreciate me, because I shouldn't have to come in and ask you for a raise. I know you can't imagine somebody doing that. But coming in and saying, I really would like to chat a little bit. Is this a convenient time that I can have about 10 or 15 minutes? Number one, you come in and you're asking permission. Number two, you're setting a time limit. And that begins to set a mode of it's okay maybe to start moving in. Hopefully your boss invites you to sit down and you can say, you know, I've been on this project, that project, here's what we've done, here's what I've accomplished, here are my contributions. I think it's worthy of considering the possibility if you might like to add an increment to my pay. If you can do it with a smile, and for me, humor is a very important adjunct for entree. If I do it judiciously, you're more likely to be received. If you got one of these vitriolic bosses who are bombastic and pounding and name-calling, that person will always be difficult in approaching. And somewhere along the line, either you have found his magic button and how to do it, or you may not get what you want. That's that part. Now, coming from the boss, what a boss needs to know, it's interesting in some of the studies they've done of CEOs, the chief executives and their vice presidents, interestingly enough, when they test them out on IQ tests, there are very, very superior ranges of IQ. That means these people have a capacity for grasping a lot of data usually and being able to filter it through, and they have a sense of persons. I think the greatest test of applied psychology is in the sales business. These are the people who know the bottom line is if I've approached people properly, I show that by the fact I've got the signature, the check, and I have made the sale. The boss in his position has to be an individual who also can come in as a good active listener, can also come in low and slow and listen well to the person, not interrupt. You know how sometimes, oh, is that right? You know, that reminds me of a story when, and then that person who's talking feels somehow he's been cheated, something has been taken away from the time that I needed. The awareness of this can't come about just by telling people. They have to be placed, in my opinion, in experiential activity where even bosses learn how they can better communicate. So like this last seminar I did, we had people in key positions and they begin to understand and appreciate more how they can do this active listening, how they can understand, how they may say, let me think about it, instead of feeling I have to make a decision at the moment. I think if people can do that, they are way ahead in building loyalty and bonding their employees, you know.
Steve Sheet. Eli, let me create a scenario and ask you how you would react to it. Let's say I have a medium-sized company with 50 employees or so, and it has various divisions, sales and service and accounting, personnel, that sort of thing. And I've grown rapidly, brought some new people in. I'm just not happy. I know that the departments aren't working well together. They sort of resent each other. And even within departments, things aren't going as smoothly as I'd like. How would you come into that situation and help turn that environment into a solid team?
I think the first thing I would do is offer a seminar that has to do with team building and bonding. Sometimes I know specialists that call in. I've had one person in a particular firm relate this to me just a few days ago. They brought someone in and they felt that person went around, asked each person different things about that, and all was said and done, the employer felt that rather than have salubrious effect, there was more tension generated by that. If you set a pattern where everybody is part of it, take all the managers of a small firm like that, bring them into a setting where I can sit down, I'd interview you. This is what I call a peer interview. And I say, Steve, and I've got a little notepad here, just like a reporter, if I were to get to know you better, what would I like about you? And then I jot down a few notes, which, by the way, for a lot of people is one of the hardest things to do, to tell what you see good in yourself, because it somewhat lacks modesty. If I were to get to know you better, Steve, what do I need to be cautioned or warned about? You know, well, I'm hard to reach until I've had my coffee in the morning or whatever. A third thing I might say, Steve, what has been a most traumatic event in your life that has happened that you feel comfortable in sharing? Then I write this down. Number 4, what's a personal sacrifice that you've met? And that's an interesting item, incidentally. Some people say nothing in particular. Another will tell you how they've not gone to school, they stayed home so they can take care of an invalid person at home. They couldn't get back until they were 50, things like that. So you don't know about it. And then the last question might be, if I, Steve, what would you like to say about your philosophy and outlook on life? So what happens then, after you and I have had a paired interview and we get to know each other, we get into a group of 6, and you introduce me to the group. Then I introduce you, and so does the group. This has got to be the most phenomenal E = M2 square way of people getting to know something about one another and feeling close by appreciating the nature of what their lives are like. I remember one church thing I heard a pastor say in his sermon. He said, people come up to me at the end of the service and they say, "Pastor, we love you." And he says, how could they really say they love me unless they've known a slice of my life? These kinds of techniques enable one to know a little bit about the slice of life of somebody else, and that is bonding.
So
I'd start that way.
let me make sure I understand you. Rather than bring the proverbial outside expert in and have him or her try to remodel the company from within, you'd actually take some of the key people out, train them, and let them build teams within the organization? Is that pretty much
Well,
the
their
pattern?
goal at that point wouldn't necessarily to build teams, but for them to get to know each other in such a way that when they have to communicate from department to department, they have some good feelings about one another. A second step in another seminar, I like to start out with a seminar approach, because it's less threatening. 2 or 3 seminars. A second seminar may then invite the people at the lower echelon to come in, so the line workers also get an idea of what communication is and what the goal is. Then a third seminar could deal with the particular issues and show them how they go back and forth. For example, I'll have them model. I'll have 2 people up here, and I'll say, go ahead and share your day. Tell me what your day was like, and I'll show how I listened to the day without coming in interrupting, without giving advice. There's a saying that the road to hell is paved by well-intentioned fools. We can have a lot of good intentions, but if we don't know what we're doing, I don't want a well-intentioned doctor operating on me if he's never done the procedure.
It sounds to me like your approach is less of a science. I'm going to teach you how to communicate. I'm going to teach you how to build a team, and much more personal. I'm going to teach you about one another, and we're going to start with good relationships between people, and the team will follow. Am I?
Thank you. That's very good. In fact, not only perhaps would I change it a little bit and say I'm not going to teach you as much as I'm going to open the door of opportunity for you to learn how to communicate and relate with one another. Because nobody learns anything unless they really want to. They have to feel this is important to them and they're in a safe environment to do that.
We just have 1 minute left.
Is that all?
That's all we have
Well,
left.
I got
It's
so
been
much more to
really
share.
interesting. Just in like 20 seconds, of all your work you've done, whether it's the workplace, what do you think is the #1 problem?
Communication.
Just communication itself.
Its lack, its deficiency, and its need to be taught, modeled, role-played, and it becomes part of the individual.
Okay. On behalf of the panel and our staff, Dr. Eli Ross, we thank you for being with us. It's been very informative, and I know that both employees and employers have picked up some tips that would be very helpful to them. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we will discuss what we believe is an important issue, and we like hearing from you about ideas that you might have for programs. Until next week, I would like to wish all of you a very good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.